As Todd Wood and I walked through the zoo, we saw incredible beauty and amazing design wherever we looked. I noticed the great diversity between some animals, as well as the remarkable similarity of others.
As a biologist, what do you see when you see all of these creatures?
Yeah, when I look at this, look at these lions specifically, I'm seeing cats myself. And all the other cats they have here at the zoo, they all have this underlying catness to them that's really apparent. It's really apparent when they start playing, right? You're seeing them playing with some sort of ball or something, and they're
just like a cat.
They look like a cat. You know, scientists would put that into a family called Felidae. And I would understand the felids to be representatives of a single created kind. So the continuity, the similarity there is so significant that I'd say, yeah, these guys have all descended from a single pair of critters that was on the ark, and that eventually generated all the different sorts of cats that we have today.
So rather than just a random accident, it appears as if all of these different species are coming from a really elaborate design.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just a design like God, designed and created the lion. It's God created something that could make a lion. So it's more like, a multi-tool or a Swiss Army knife where you got all these pieces that you can just pop out whenever you need them, but it's all just one thing.
So give me some other examples of created kinds.
Yeah, so you've got the grizzlies and the polar bear. Those are all members of the bear kind. You've got ducks, swans, and geese. The thing about the dog kind is really interesting. So you take just this wolf-like creature, and we can breed in only a few hundred years many different breeds.
Well, Todd, that's kind of fascinating now to think about what God was doing when he was bringing two of every kind. What do you think was going on there?
Oh, yeah. I mean, he doesn't have to bring every little variety onto the ark. So when you actually do the calculations, and okay, so we don't know exactly how many created kinds there were on the ark, but maybe a couple thousand, and they're small. Most animals are quite small, so you have room to spare, literally room to spare. And all of that diversity that we have today is built into those two of every kind.
Well, Todd, we're looking at the zebras, and they're all unique, and yet all of these creatures are just so much complexity and diversity. How does the standard story, the conventional paradigm, explain all of that?
Well, they would use evolution, right? So millions of years, random variations, all things that are alive now, that cactus, that zebra, the grass here, it's all related. We all go back to a common ancestor that lived billions of years ago. And through the process of mutation and genetic variation and natural selection, that's where we get the stuff that we have today.
So, natural selection, what is it? Does it have the kind of creative potential that we need for all of this?
Natural selection is basically all about killing off things that aren't fit for the environment. So if you're a finch in the Galapagos and you have a really tiny beak and the only food available to you is really big, hard seeds, you're gonna die. And that's exactly what we observe. And so we can watch over the generations as the beak size and finches change in the Galapagos. But they're still finches, they're still birds. The notion that natural selection can generate all of the diversity we see, that's not been demonstrated. What we find most often with natural selection is that natural selection does a lot of fine-tuning. So right over here, we've got these oryxes, right? Beautiful creatures and very, very pale colors. The wild range of the oryx is right on the southern end of the Sahara Desert. And so you can see, yeah, their coloration makes sense. If you get a really dark colored one, that's going to be really easy for predators to find. And so they end up being these really beautiful light colors. And that's an example of where selection would take a variation and turn it into an adaptation.
And that brings us back to the notion that a really exquisite design in the beginning
think so. Absolutely.
Has provided these creatures with the ability to survive and to change for their benefit.
Absolutely. So the ability to be able to change your coloration like that, to be able to fit an environment, that's got to be built into the system before it starts. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, natural selection and random variation can do amazing things. I mean, it's pretty astonishing the kinds of changes that we can see, but we don't see one kind changing into another. All we see are variations that happen within a created kind. So there's a felid tree, which has all the cats on it. There's the canid tree, which has all the dogs on it. There's the ursid tree, which has all the bears on it. There's the equid tree with all the horses on it. Each individual created kind, then, has its own individual tree, so that you end up with something like an orchard or a forest.
As a scientist, it seems what you're saying is that the Genesis paradigm answers all of this data better.
Ultimately, I think it does, because it embraces both similarity and difference. Now, as we've already said, there's lots of questions that are still out there. But I'm pretty confident, given what our paradigm can explain, I'm very confident that those answers are going to be found.
After we left the zebras, we made our way to the gorillas. Todd wanted to talk about the question of human evolution.
Todd, we see it all the time, a new discovery, new skulls, new skeletons that supposedly solidify this whole link.
Yeah.
What do you see there?
Absolutely. Well, I got some right here in my bag.
Ooh, a skull.
So this guy is a Neanderthal, very, very low forehead. So we have really tall foreheads. The face, the mid face has been pulled out. But at the same time, well, it looks very human. So that's Neanderthal.
Okay.
You want to hold that one for me?
Yeah.
Okay. We have others that are very different.
Oh, yeah.
Now this one is Australopithecus africanus. So you can see really no forehead at all. It just slopes right back. Very, very small brain case. Muzzle sticks way out, so the face is sloped forward. What do you do with this stuff? I mean, there's many more that we could show, many more pictures, many more skulls, and you can see, looking at them together, they're really, there's a lot of difference there.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. So all that created kind stuff that we already talked about, I can show again and again and again with multiple studies that I can find a discontinuity between humans and non-humans. So this thing lands on the human side. This Neanderthal here, it's one of us. This thing is not. It is different. But this would be just another one of those varieties of living things that God made in the beginning and that survived the flood aboard the ark.
So when we look at Neanderthal man, we're looking at a human, but it's a human that, just like we find in dogs, we have a lot of variety of dogs.
We got a lot of variety of people. So even looking back here at the gorilla, we can see the obvious differences between us and him, not the least of which is that he's in there and we can go home when we're done.
And so those differences are really huge, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. The image of God entails this idea of being God's representative here on this earth. Part of that, then, is having dominion and having authority, spiritual quality that we have that we don't share with animals like that.
It's obvious we're different from the rest of creation because we're made in God's image. We're the only ones to create zoos so we can see the beauty of God's animals. And we're unique in tracking time and wanting to know our own history. But where does our concept of time come from? It was a beautiful night. Danny took me far outside the city and kept me up very late in order to show me something I will never forget.
Oh my goodness, now you're gonna make me buy a telescope.
But you know, we have some purposes given for the stars in Genesis 1:14-19. That's the day 4 creation account. It mentions the stars and other heavenly bodies to mark time, to rule over the night, to be for signs, seasons, festivals, and so forth. People have been using the stars for marking passage of time. The patterns repeat every night. They repeat every year. They come back in their season. There's a lot of regularity going on here.
What about the design of the sun and the moon?
Well, there are a couple of things I can talk about. On rare occasions, the moon passes between us and the sun. Doesn't happen very often. And when that happens, the moon just barely covers the sun up. If the moon were a little smaller or a little farther away, it wouldn't do it at all. If it were larger or closer to us, it would be grossly over total. And so these eclipses are spectacular and rare, and this is the only planet on which it matters, and it's the only planet which it happens. And you've got to think either just that's the way the world is for no apparent reason, or the world is that way for a purpose and design. And to me, that speaks of creation. Okay, high overhead here we have the Great Square of Pegasus. It's this big rectangle. Now coming off of Pegasus is a little fuzzy spot right there. Do you see that?
Yes.
That's the Andromeda Galaxy. That is the most distant object that you can see with the naked eye. It's a little, we think a little over 2 million light years away, and it contains a couple 100 billion stars.
Wow. Okay, Danny, that brings me to a big question, and a big question in a lot of people's minds. If we have stars that are that far away, millions of light years away, and if the Earth is young, as we believe, then how in the world can the starlight be here?
Yeah, we call this the light travel time problem, and I'll try to phrase it for you a little differently. We believe that the creation is only thousands of years old, say 6,000 years, 7,000 years, something like that. And I've just pointed out something to you that we think is 2 million light years away from us. I think those distances are reasonably correct. And we creationists need to answer this question, and we've offered several different solutions to that. I'll discuss with you my solution on this. Several things jump out at me in the creation account. One, there was a lot of process going on, very rapid process, but still process. If you look at the day 3 account, it talks about plants rising up out of the ground. It says, let the earth bring forth these plants, and the earth brought forth. I think if you would have been there, it would have looked like a time-lapse movie. Growth that might take normally decades taking place in a matter of minutes or hours at the most. Normal growth abnormally fast. I believe you can interpret one day of creation in terms of another day. So I turn to the day 4 account. Not much information is given there, but I think God also rapidly made the stars and other astronomical bodies. And then in order for them to fulfill their function to be seen, he had to rapidly bring forth that light, just as he brought plants and matured them quickly. He had to bring that light here. I'm suggesting when we actually look at these objects, like the Andromeda Galaxy we saw a few minutes ago, we're looking at light that actually left that object.
Yes.
So I think there's a rapid maturing took place.
Danny, are there some other things that you see that would point to a young universe?
I think so. For instance, spiral galaxies. The Andromeda Galaxy we talked about is a spiral galaxy. Our own is. And the inside of the galaxies should spin faster than the outside of the galaxy. So after a few rotations, you ought to wind up or smear out those spiral patterns. They ought to disappear after a few rotations. Now, most astronomers think that spiral galaxies are 10 billion years old. So why do we still see spiral patterns? You shouldn't see those. And it's been long recognized as a problem. But also, if we look at the outer planets of the solar system, the gas giants, they all have rings. And we also know that these things are changing. They're wiping out. They've actually documented changes that have taken place within the ring system. You have all these gravitational tugs from the other satellites orbiting around. So these ring systems are fairly young. It doesn't prove the solar system is young, but it proves that these ring systems are young. And that's interesting.
We've mentioned a lot of theories about the spirals and so forth. It brings us to what most people see as the big theory concerning cosmology and the universe, and that's the Big Bang. How do you see that? Is it holding up over time?
I don't think so. I think it's getting some problems. So much so that more than a dozen years ago, I think in the New Scientist magazine, there was an open letter protesting the Big Bang Theory, and it's had hundreds of signatories since. And most of the people signing it are atheists. They're not even creationists. So this idea that the Big Bang model is universally accepted is not true. There are many people out there, well-known people, very famous physics and astronomy people, that have real problems with the Big Bang. And I don't see any way that you can reconcile Big Bang with the Bible, though a lot of people seem to think that you can. I think the temptation they have there is to try to interpret Scripture in terms of the current cosmological thinking. That's nothing new. That's happened before, as it's turned out, with disastrous results. So I think when you look at the history of science, the way we've discarded theories over time, you've had theories that were supposedly beyond dispute, and then later on discarded. When you see that lesson from history and then you want to wed Genesis, you want to interpret Genesis in terms of the ruling paradigm, I think you need to be very careful.
I realized Danny was reorienting our perspective. We need to interpret the universe in terms of Genesis, not the other way around. And Genesis tells us that God created the sun, moon, and stars to be a magnificent clock to track the passage of time. Even the ancients built towers to follow the stars. But what does Genesis say about those people and the languages they spoke? Doug took me to one of the best archaeological museums in the world to show me some of the unique artifacts that relate to Genesis.
Well, the events of the Bible are unfolded in the ancient Near East. So all of these lands are extremely important to understanding how and what took place in the biblical text.
So this picks up these events we've been looking at in Genesis, from creation and the flood, and now we're to the dispersion of mankind out of Noah and his family.
Exactly. And the dispersion would have taken place somewhere in this mountain range to the northwest of Mesopotamia. And what we see in the biblical text in the narrative is that a number of people have migrated down to southern Mesopotamia, the land of Shinar, and moved toward the process of urbanization, city living.
And that's the famous Tower of Babel.
Absolutely.
Do we know where that is?
There are about 7 or 8 Babels, cities of Babel, in the ancient area of Mesopotamia. And so one at a time, I've studied all of those areas and found only one that meets all the criteria of the famous site of the Tower of Babel. And that is the site of Eridu, which is in southeastern Mesopotamia. We have signs of the expansion to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west, all the way as far as Egypt.
And when you say evidence, that is the artifacts that we find in these archaeological digs?
Exactly. There's an enormous amount and very specific kinds of material culture that attest to this expansion of people that I'm connecting to the post-Babel dispersion. Here are the beveled rim bowls, these two, which is that Rimkin brick that we see up there, and those 2 spouted jars. All of these diagnostic forms of pottery and material culture, they're found throughout the Near East. The Bible describes an event that's not just the confusion of language, but it's the dispersing of people far from that city. And because we see language or the written expression of language just pop up out of nowhere, and then different languages being represented through cuneiform script or through hieroglyphic script or other means. So you do not have a universal plan that's followed among all of the languages. You see great diversity in the forms of grammar from language to language, even in ancient languages.
It seems then that the event recorded in Genesis about the Tower of Babel, that's a very, very critical event for archaeology.
It is. So all of this fits perfectly with what we would see as the biblical account of how languages took place. It's really the only way of explaining this. So the integrity of biblical history ultimately is justified by the expression of these languages.
Now, most of us think today of a tower, the kinds of things we see in big cities, big straight walls. Is that what they were building?
Well, essentially, it's a variation of a pyramid. And there were 4 sides to it and several stairways that would go up to the top. At Eridu, we have a temple that existed in 18 different phases. And in every phase, it grew in its size and its complexity. And that final temple, that final phase of the temple, it was abandoned immediately, right at the time of the late Uruk expansion. Catacornered to the temple was an absolutely enormous platform.
Do you think that could be the foundation of the Tower of Babel?
Absolutely, and I would suggest to you that this late Uruk expansion, where this technology began, was something that spread with the people. We find forms of these ziggurats all around the globe. We find them in China, we find them in India, we find them in various parts of the Americas. We find them all over.
Well, obviously we have evidence here of civilization and people beginning to gather together in communities, even cities. Do we have any other evidence of that?
Absolutely. We can move forward to the time of Abraham because we know that Abraham lived at the site of Ur, which was also in southern Mesopotamia, at the end of the 3rd millennium BC.
That brings us to the end of Genesis chapter 11.
Exactly. In fact, you see some pottery, some cuneiform tablets, all dating to the period of the 3rd dynasty of Ur.
It's amazing just as we're sitting here thinking about that, thinking about Abraham and that this represents the culture and the civilization that he lived in. It's a great tie to that record in Genesis 4.
It is fascinating, and it gives you a feeling of putting your hands around the events that go on in the biblical text.
When I look back through history, I realized each of these cultures had been impacted by the events recorded in Genesis. But what is the importance of Genesis to us today? George Grant wanted to meet me at a garden near his home. He said it was a good reminder of where our history began.
So there's something significant about the Genesis text in which Adam and Eve are then placed into a garden to tend it. That's more than just a story.
It's much more than just a story. One of the things that you see in Genesis chapter 1 is the structure for time. The universe is created for a 24-hour day. And so everything from the way our sleep cycles and the way our work cycles work all come from that definitive historical account there. When we get to Genesis chapter 2, we start to see the meaning and purpose of man. Of course, in Genesis chapter 3, we see the disruption of everything by the fall. And the implications of an historical fall, an actual man and an actual woman who actually yielded to actual sin, have then implications all through the rest of the Bible. If you remove a literal Adam and Eve, that changes the whole shape of what history is and how history is remembered.
Is that because when we pull an Adam and Eve out of a historical record, we can then pretty much make up what we think about man and marriage and even sexuality?
Absolutely. The Apostle Paul understood the events of the early chapters of Genesis as formative, not only for our understanding of history, but for relationships between men and women and their children, the character and nature of marriage, rightness and wrongness in moral relations, including sexuality. All of that is assumed from those early chapters of Genesis, oftentimes quoting the passages verbatim.
It seems that even Peter is taking that event of the flood, for example, as a historical event and laying it in the context of what he's pointing to, a judgment that will come. So even judgment is a part of understanding that historical record.
You cut things off from history and you lose sight of the meaning of all of it.
I think most Christians, when we talk about, for example, the life of Christ, those are understood to be historical accounts. Right. Why is it that when we look at the account in Genesis, that we have a tendency not to want to do that?
We have a tendency not to do it because we're constantly exhorted to not see it that way.
From the culture around us?
The culture around us, from theologians, modern theologians who are trying to somehow, in their minds, fit the truths of Scripture with the so-called discoveries of science, which, if you know anything about the history of science, you know is an incredibly unreliable path. So we're constantly bombarded with this message that we have to adjust our view.
But I think there are a lot of Christians who have a sense that the historicity of Genesis is just not that important to their Christianity.
I think we've been sold a bill of goods on that. When you somehow make those chapters a different category altogether and non-historical, What are you doing to all of the rest of the Bible? The Bible that assumes that it's true, the Bible that treats it as historically true, the Bible that refers back to all of the characters that are there. Does that then negate the whole of the Bible? Well, yes. And that's exactly what the strategy was of the higher critics in the 18th and 19th centuries. They knew if you could somehow attack the first 3 or the first 11 chapters of Genesis, you've done away with the whole thing.
Well, George, all of this brings us back then to the notion that the history that's recorded in Genesis, or any true history at all, is critical for us in terms of understanding what's going on around us.
Yeah, in fact, it reminds us of how important history is in anchoring all of the other human disciplines. It is history that helps to inform science so that science can begin its journey of discovery in the world. So what history does is it tells us what happened. Then what science attempts to do is it asks the question, well, how did it happen? And then it begins to explore the how, the mechanics, the structures that were present in those events. If you try and reverse that, if you try and make science saying what actually happened, then you wind up having a worldview that is constantly shifting where nothing is certain. And moral relativism is the necessary outcome.
And God has given us that bedrock. He's given us that foundation in that historical record.
He's given it to us in that historical record, going all the way back to Genesis chapter 1 and the garden.
In the end, I suppose we always return home. And for me, home is Colorado. I always think more clearly when I'm out in the beauty of God's creation. We've been a lot of places and seen a lot of things, but considering everything together, it's clear that nothing in the world makes sense except in the light of Genesis.
I love being in the mountains, especially ones like these. They help give us a good perspective, help us realize that we're small and finite and vulnerable. They humble us. And we need to be humbled because we have a tendency to base our ideas on our own small set of experiences. That's why the wisdom of the ages has told us over and over again to know history. Everything that we have done up to this point has looked at the evidence that shows us that the Word of God, the history that has been laid down for us in Genesis, is true. God created the world in 6 days. There is a real Adam, a real Eve. There is a real fall. There was a real flood that destroyed the world and produced all of this. It is glorious, but it represents the judgment of God. Everything supports what God has told us. Genesis is history, true history.